Hello everybody and welcome to this 5th webinar on open source verification. My name is Henrietta Wilson. I'm really pleased to be working on this project with Dan Plesch and Olamide Samuel from SOAS University, and thank you to them for all their support in getting these webinars together, and of course to the SOAS Scrap students who are instrumental in making it all happen. We have another 3 really exciting speakers lined up for us today. We have Ali Arbia from ACAPS and Daniel Liu from King's College London Project Alpha, and Dan Plesch from SOAS. So I'll be handing over to them in a moment. But before I do so, as usual, I'm going to say a few introductory comments about where we're at in this webinar series. So this is the 5th webinar. We've had 4 webinars so far and we have another 2 planned. So it's really worth taking stock of what we're learning, some of the things that are emerging from this work. So just to give you a really quick overview, in the webinars we've had so far, we've had 15 speakers from different organisations doing different sorts of open source verification. Now we've got another 3. In this one, we'll have another 8 in the 2 remaining webinars. So a really diverse mixture of people. And on top of all of that, behind the scenes, I've been having a lot of research conversations with different open source practitioners around the world. So there's a lot of different stuff coming out of these conversations. And I want to just start by foregrounding this sense that open source research is a real growth area. There's a lot of it happening around the world with very different approaches, with very different attitudes and roles. And lots of these have kind of connections and are interrelated and are addressing overlapping themes, but lots of them are quite independent and separate from each other as well. So I'm just going to share my slides again to sum up some of the themes that I've been thinking about in my conversations and work. So, oh, this isn't working. I'll have another go at that. Sorry, this is taking me a little while. I'll be there shortly. There we go. What I've been finding out is some sort of overlapping themes that are emerging from these conversations. As I said, there's all sorts of different types of monitoring and they're doing different sorts of things. So through the webinars, we've seen examples of open source research that's been fundamentally aimed at correcting misinformation. And I point to Richard Guthrie's case study of the Yellow Rain incident, a historical piece of research by Julian Perry Robinson and Matt Messelson, in which, through open sources, they managed to dispel allegations of use of biological warfare in South Asia. So it's really important that open source researchers, non-governmental researchers, can correct false allegations. Apart from that, I think open source research is really usefully uncovering a bunch of unknown information in different categories. So some of the projects we've seen have been uncovering things that people know are unknown. Jamie Withorn gave an example of her research looking at sanctions in North Korea, where she knew that some of the tracking processes were being evaded. So you start to think about how you find out about what you know you don't know. There's also been examples of projects uncovering unknown unknowns and tracking flows of information, piecing together, triangulating different sources of information to put together a compelling piece of information, a picture of what's going on in a place that was thought to be hidden. There's also differences in this open source work of the sorts of political impact people are trying to achieve. So the sorts of work that I'm interested in are really concerned with sort of progressive politics, projects that are trying to make the world a better place in some sort of way. There is other sort of open source intelligence work, which is maybe more commercial, or doing other sorts of things. But the focus of this set of webinars is really on the small non-governmental organisations and research groups that are trying to increase transparency, either to empower citizens or to inform decisions in different sorts of ways. So we've seen examples of those sorts of things through the webinars. We've also had discussions around, can open source research, can open source verification be more than the sum of its parts? And we thought about different opportunities and challenges for doing this. So the opportunities maybe revolve around, can projects be coordinated in some sort of way? Is there other opportunities to share information, share technology? Challenges. I think it's definitely an open question how this sort of work could be harnessed to be more than it's doing already. So I'll be interested to see if we can explore that more in this webinar. So thank you very much for that. I'll just now very quickly outline how this webinar is going to work. We're going to have 3 short talks. Throughout those talks, please do feel free to post any questions or comments via the chat function. And if you do so, if you could add your name and affiliation, that would be great. I mean, I guess I have your name anyway, but your affiliation would be very helpful if you're happy to share that. The presentation side of this webinar will finish at around 3 o'clock, and then we'll move to more informal discussions. So if people then are happy to share their video and their chat, that would be great. Okay, so now I'm delighted to be able to hand over to Ali for his presentation. Ali works at ACAPS, and I know he'll be saying a bit about his work. Yeah, thank you very much, Ali.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. I will try to share my screen. I hope. So it's the first time I'm doing this on Zoom. Can you already see my screen? If not,
not yet, Ali.
Okay. Otherwise, I'll do it without the presentation because it's not. Okay.
There we go.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay. So sorry for that. Do you see the slide, or do you also see the big like this? Does that work? Do you see the screen now? Sorry.
You're fine.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, thanks. So yeah, as Henrietta said, so my name is Ali Arbia. Before I start, just a little grain of salt. I'm relatively new to ACAPS, so I've worked for ACAPS now for half a year, but I'm definitely new to the humanitarian sector. So I hope I do justice to the work of my colleagues. I can by now fairly competently talk about my own work, but so I hope that I will be able to answer questions if there are questions, but I might have to double check with my colleagues later and come back to you to give you some of the answers. The way I wanted to structure this presentation is I'll give you a little bit of context, who we are and what we do, because I think that probably our work is a little bit different from most other people who have presented so far in this series or will present. I will quickly give you an idea of what we do, and then I'll come to the main part, which is how do we do it, because I think this is probably the part that is most interesting. A lot of this will be about how we do the work and less about the sources specifically or what kind of sources we work with, but you will see why I have structured it that way. So ACAPS, we are a team of probably now about 40 people. We have hubs in Bangladesh, Colombia. I'm based in Geneva, where the biggest group is working, where a lot of the analysis is happening. We have various donors. They change a little every year. This is the most up-to-date slide I could find. And in terms of governing structure, we have a consortium that is in charge, and so it's composed of the Norwegian Refugee Council and Save the Children. So what do we do? There are four areas where we are active. We do analysis, tailored support. This is what my team does quite a lot of. We also do capacity building. So we have humanitarian training courses, a program, and advocacy. For this presentation, I will mainly talk about analysis because this is what is relevant for the topic here. So just what the type of analysis we do, we work on global comparisons, we do trend analysis, we look at risks, multiple crises in one country, crisis going across national borders. I think to get an idea, I invite you to go to our website. You will see everything we do is published there, also databases, etc. So I think if you're interested, I invite you to go to our website. That's probably the best way to get more familiar with our work. So the typical outputs you will find there are, we do online crisis analysis. These are very short pieces. Briefing notes, this is a lot coming out of my team. They are supposed to be timely and very focused. I will get back to that in a minute. And then we have more in-depth thematic reports. We do anticipatory reports, trying to do scenario building and risk analysis. Of course, this, depending on what you're working on or my colleagues are working on, this also means that the approach is slightly different, as well as the sources that are used for that. So to get to the meat of the presentation, and that's what you're probably most interested in is, so how do we do that analysis? And I'd like to start with the specific challenges we're facing, because I think this is the interesting part, how we try to solve challenges. Some of them will be familiar to you. Others probably are quite specific to the kind of work we do. So the first challenge is timeliness. So we often work on very short time spans. So for example, my team, the rapid analysis team, we get regular alerts and requests for briefing notes that we have to deliver within 24 hours. A lot of traditional databases, information that you can find is not updated on such a short-term basis. So this is one thing we need to find solutions for. Then the specificity of some of the requests we get, often it's about the humanitarian crisis that is very localized. So we're really talking about a specific district in the country where you might not have a lot of information to begin with. Or sometimes it's thematically very specific, meaning that actually you need the input of someone with technical knowledge and technical expertise, which again, we do not necessarily have in-house. And then that's probably familiar to most of you. So you always end up having conflicting or unclear information because it's often about rapidly developing crisis. The number today will not be the same like in 2 days when we talk about floods or earthquakes, etc. And in addition, a problem that we have is that the best information usually is available with the organizations on the ground that are there, but they of course have their own incentives and biases when they report things, and there are questions of, and I mean that in the most neutral way possible, but there are questions of funding, of organizational specialization, etc. So what we are trying to do is to come in and give a less biased version of the situation and provide information that the humanitarian decision makers on the spot can make the right decisions and hopefully help more people that way. So in terms of sources we are using, that's nothing exciting at all. We base ourselves on news sources that that are openly accessible. We often go back to specialized reports, because if you write about things like nutrition or wash facilities, etc., often you need some organizations that have a specific expertise. So like the OCHA or the World Food Organization. And then we also try to use our own network and contacts we have. We had an attempt building that network up, but it's difficult to have to keep a formal network up, and also to have the right people, because if you cover the globe and the information you need is often very specific and localized, even if you have a vast network of expertise and local knowledge, that you hit exactly that spot that you need to hit is not obvious. So this is my last slide, and this is actually the one that is the important slide. So how do we try to solve these challenges, and how do we approach the work? So one thing is we aim for good enough. So not for very good or perfect, but good enough. The idea is that that the people on the ground or people interested in reading our products, that they get the information they need. Not as much information as possible, but that we really try to target to give them what they need, and as detailed or not detailed as it is needed. We also often say, so we try to make sense, not data. It's always easy to throw a lot of data at people, but I think what we try to do is really give the value added with the interpretation of the data, doing the analysis. The line is not always that clear when you switch from just, as I said, throwing data at people to providing the interpretation to the data. And then the last point for the good enough is that we also try, so for example, in my work, if we have 24 hours to provide a briefing note, the art is not necessarily to find the information, but what is difficult is to say, okay, this is enough. This is what people need. This is enough to take a decision. So it's more about how to find that point when things are good enough. Then we work a lot with templates and workflows, and I think again this is specific to the challenges we face. So if we want to be as timely as possible, we work with templates, so we don't have to start from zero every time. It also makes training of analysts a lot easier. You will see why, but we have quite a big turnover in terms of analysts. So working with templates makes that part of the data collection and analysis much more efficient. The same for workflows. So we do, for example, we have the crisis insight team. They give ratings of crisis. You can also find that on our webpage. And they're also quite precise workflows, so it's easy to train people. It assures a certain coherence across time. And so again, it makes training easier. We also produce our own data sets. So far we had crisis insight, but also access. We have now with COVID-19 2 new data sets where we, and I'll get back to that, experiment a little bit with the data collection. So we have one on government measures that were taken and one on the secondary impact. That's all new of COVID-19. the way we approach that, these two data sets is, so we have student volunteers all across the globe, which allows us to diversify also a little bit the points of view and to have more local. We onboard them, and there's quite a turnover, but with established procedures, we can manage that quite well. And the last point is, so we do something similar for the analysis. So a big part of our analysis is done by trainee analysts. We have a trainee program where analysts come in for a year. We give them a way of starting in the humanitarian analysis area, give them trainings, provide them with guidance so they learn on the job. And at the same time, we get some valuable analysis out of that system. But this is why we have the need of having being able to deal with a big turnover and still provide a certain coherence and consistency in what we do. So this is a brief summary how we work. You might have noticed, so I put a lot of emphasis on procedures, processes, because I think this is probably what is most interesting for you and what is the more innovative part of the way we function. Yeah, so I'm done with my slides. If you're interested in more information, please don't hesitate to go to our website or ask questions. Now I try to unshare my screen. Good.
Thank you, Ali. That was a fantastic 10 minutes, giving us a really clear flavour of how far-reaching ACAPS is. Under this umbrella term for humanitarian monitoring, you're covering so many different sectors, so many different locations, and often in a really speedy way. So you gave a really interesting insight in how you reconcile the need for very speedy responses with being accurate, and how you go for a good enough client-focused solution to that, which seems great to me. I just wanted to follow up before handing over to the next speaker. In earlier webinars, there's been mention of how disinformation and misinformation on the internet can really complicate open source research. And I wondered if in your work, how you guard against this, how it interrupts your work. And I would think that that's particularly challenging when you're working across different geographies, because there's such cultural specificity in how people report on things, how they're regarded. So I don't know if you can comment on that at all now, or if you'd like to wait a moment. Yeah,
I can try to. So I'd say so far it has not been a huge problem for us. I guess it has to do because a lot of information you're working on is actually quite technical. So it goes back to things like nutrition, shelters, non-food items. So it's less of an issue. I think it probably we have slight problems like this when it comes then to the broader context, in the context of armed violence. But as this is not the core of our work, mostly can be solved also by avoiding certain ambiguity just by being very transparent, what we know, what we don't know, but it's not central usually to what we write about. So this is quite easy. And I think the second point why it's not a big problem is because we have to work on such short notice, or we try to be as speedy as possible. I mean, one way of doing it is also you just have certain sources you always come back. Certain databases, certain sources of information. And so in a certain sense, it's almost like we have some sources, some trusted sources, almost like pre-selected. And they usually build the core of what we write about.
Great, great answer. So I think that's, we've heard similar things from other speakers over the course of the webinars in different balance between those different aspects. So yes, transparency, making clear where you've got your evidence from and not over claiming on your conclusions, and also tracking things isn't just a matter of getting a slam dunk piece of data. It's about building confidence and knowledge and expertise over time, and some of that is through building trusted networks that you can rely on. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ali. I'm now going to introduce Dan Liu from King's College London, Project Alpha. Thank you very much, Daniel. It'd be great to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Great. I'm just going to quickly try and share my screen. Stand by, please. Can everyone hear that? Can everyone see this?
Yes, thank you, Dan.
Amazing. All right, here we go. So again, thank you very much, Henrietta, and for inviting us to be here. My name is Dan Liu, and I am a researcher at King's College London at the Centre for Science and Security Studies. I'm going to, following from Ali's discussion and sort of really great insight into the sort of strategic level humanitarian analysis, I'm going to bring it down to a very tactical level example of the level of frustrations and sort of the trials and tribulations of a of open source verification and sort of following up on publicly known information, but using open sources. So a bit about what we do first. So Project Alpha, we are a knowledge transfer program within King's College London, and we specifically focus on sort of informing and skilling up practitioners in specifically the non-proliferation fields. So basically that includes sanctions, strategic trade controls, proliferation finance, and so on. So in the sort of the investigation side of house, we use a range of open source tools and techniques to sort of study all aspects of non-proliferation, from its financing to its sanctions evasion networks, to how these networks grow, change, and all these other dynamics. Of course, the traditional targets of sanctions investigation and non-proliferation investigations obviously involve around the DPRK. But we also have specific technical safeguards on nuclear safety as part of CISS. The maritime and China are aspects that we also look a lot into, and also strategic trade control policy, proliferation finance policy, as well as throwing more interesting and innovative ideas such as using sort of mass data sets, data fusion, and also applying a bit of machine learning into enhancing and making analysts' workflows better. So I'm going to sort of specifically talk about one case, and that case is COVID in Sudan. This is a case that the UN panel of experts on North Korea have been following for a very long time, and it is a case where after the UN panel of experts have gotten information from a nation state, they were informed that the North Korean government and the Sudanese government were in cooperation to transfer series of 122 precision guided munitions and also air attack satellite guided missiles from the DPRK to Sudan. They knew from information provided by them from a nation state that it involved a company called Future Electric Company that ostensibly was in China, and also Korean Mining Development Trading Corporation, which is or COMID, which is a known DPRK gun running cover shell network, is sort of the main instigator behind this transaction. So after picking apart the UN panel of experts report, so we can kind of already see some interesting leads. One is sort of the key individuals involved that was said by the panel from the DPRK side. We also know that the UN panel of experts also have knowledge of a shell company that's resident in China, that's specifically in the Haidan district of Beijing. And we also know that Future Electric Company is sort of the main sort of vehicle of which this transaction is taking place. But this is where things starts getting a bit interesting, because Future Electric Company sounds incredibly generic, and then when you have the wide variety of ways that you can sort of permutate and combine different ways of making this name in various languages in the jurisdictions involved, in Chinese, in Korean, in English, in Romanized Korean, and Romanized Chinese, or in Arabic. All of these you start getting an incredibly large list of probable selectors for you to start your search with. And so what we typically do at Project Alpha is we look at corporate registries that is open and publicly available by any member of the public. So these are the best example in the UK is Companies House, where you plonk in a name of a company, and they should have the company details because it's a matter of registering a company in a jurisdiction. So for example of this, we used something similar in Nigeria, where we had Genco, which is another North Korean sanctions evasion network. So as you can see here, this is a relatively open and shut case. We have DPRK addresses, and we know exactly when they were registered. In the case of Sudan, however, what we would have relied on is not available. According to the Open Data Index, the company register in Sudan is very much closed to sort of members of the public, and it is not available for us to sort of use. Okay, then that's a step backwards, but we can also think about other ways of getting at this problem. What about methods of transshipment? We know that in order for a shipment to go from case A to B, there have to be vectors. So things we have to consider is the types of. Okay, if it's maritime, then okay, maybe they're using different shipping companies in China. Okay, and South Sudan. But then maybe previous webinars have also told how complicated maritime shipping analysis is, and sort of all the sort of the AIS drifting and dark activities that maritime networks engage in to sort of evade detection. So that's something that we need to be considerate. Second, okay, what about through air? We know that air carrier is heavily sanctioned, and we have and there are public data sets and web and sort of platforms that actively monitor sort of the current position of entire fleets of commercial airlines. That could be a possibility. And what about through land? We know that from the UN panel of experts reports that a lot of the DPRK agents that came through and sealed the deal were accredited or traveling through Egypt. Maybe that was sort of the land route that was through here. So that involves. So as you can see here, even with that, has an incredible large array of possibilities and a large array of sort of and sort of avenues of investigation that an individual analyst will have to go through and track down. So sometimes we get lucky. Sometimes we get bills of lading data that specifically point us to a specific transaction. So the bills of lading data are for those unfamiliar, are sort of pieces of sort of declarations that that when a consignee sort of ships something, would have to declare to the customs authority of who am I, where am I sending it to, who's going to receive it, what is my address, what is inside, and so on and so forth. Sometimes that's commercially or publicly available, and we can get sort of the type of specific tactical level data of who sent what where. Unfortunately, unfortunately in this case, this is not the case. So we through this particular transaction, we looked for China to Sudan, and with the keywords of Future Electric as a company. But we get a lot of these hits, but none of them really sort of match the time frame or sort of the typology of the companies we're looking for. So no dice there. Okay, so maybe so what about we expand it a bit more further? Maybe we just look beyond just the two companies to look to the other parts of the network. Okay, we're getting a bit desperate here, but let's have a go. So this is what we know of the current network in Sudan, as told by the UN panel of experts. Maybe we can branch it out to the rest of the continent. Okay, this is getting a bit complicated. We have all of these networks, we have all of these individuals, and also roaming around different areas, doing different things, and setting up their own shell companies. That's going to be a bit difficult to track, but thankfully we've got a large amount of corporate registry data that's publicly available. We can maybe start tracking some of this. Let's go in a bit more deeper. Oh no, this is starting to get a bit messy, and this is kind of and once you sort of like start mapping out the different networks and companies from every single piece of data from their shell, from every sort of shell company, every linked company to shell companies, or companies that were listed by the UN Panel of Experts report, or companies that were sanctioned, that you get something like this. An incredibly nebulous network of shell companies, intermediaries, that maybe one could be the needle that you're looking for. Maybe one could be the sort of the transaction or the key intermediary that is doing this that is doing this specific transshipment. And this is to say nothing about the type of financing mechanisms that these sort of networks are going with. So this is an example of Glocom, which is another network affiliated with COMID and this is what we have put out in 2017 about one particular network's financial sort of proliferation finance mechanisms. As you can see here, multiple jurisdictions, multiple layers of shell companies to hide the fact that a transaction is going from one jurisdiction and ultimately to the DPRK. So I guess all of this sort of like large scale hunt for essentially what ended up to be a really, really unfruitful sort of investigation kind of highlights a couple of things. One is detecting single transshipments is challenging, and you've seen that. But imagine if you're trying to scale that into a global transshipments sort of mechanism. That's going to be even more challenging. The second is you might have seen China comes up again and again and again. China's centrality in global trade makes it essential for future arms and trafficking and verification efforts. The extent of which the Beijing authorities is able to cooperate with the international community and their willingness to share data, to enhance their export controls, is going to be crucial for how we tackle sort of conventional arms shipments. This is I've shown you a case, only for a very, very tiny case, but if you look at sort of Nigeria, sort of Fulani herdsman conflicts, you'll see that the most majority of seized ammunition come from China. If you look at the componentry for the avionics behind drones in the Houthi Yemen conflict, you'll see a lot of the componentry ultimately come from Chinese manufacturers. Again, centrality makes them pivotal for future verification efforts. Third is that open source verification alone has its limits. You've seen how from a desk-based researcher from thousands and thousands of miles with limited knowledge of local context, limited knowledge of local language, will butt up against a lot of challenges, and it is vital to sort of for open source investigators to partner up and link their research techniques with local activists, academics, journalists, to sort of enhance and sort of complete the cycle, complete the information cycle, if you will. So that's kind of my three takeaway points. This concludes my brief. Are there any questions?
Daniel, thank you so much. What an amazingly another really rich exploration and showcase of what open source research looks like. You know, you really gave a flavour to me of a treasure hunt that there's researchers kind of trying to collect minute bits of information and put them together to find something, and maybe you'll get the treasure, maybe you won't, you just don't know at the end. You made me think of all sorts of things. I think your point about it's essential to get China on board is really interesting and is worth exploring further. Last week we had a presentation from Feya Leshniewska about the Chinese mobilization of the digital earth idea. So trying to coordinate tracking of environmental things to try to address climate change. And she pointed out it's not straightforward. This is very difficult. I myself has found it quite hard to connect to Chinese open source researchers, which may or may not seem obvious, but I'd be really interested to hear any thoughts you have about how that could be made to happen, because we'd be really interested in doing that. I was also very interested by your presentation, your sort of idea that what you're doing is you're collecting whatever openly available information that there is, whether it's from Companies House or the maritime routes or wherever it comes from. And it struck me that there's, as you pointed out, there's a limit to this. Not everybody is following best practice or what's perceived as best practice. Even when there is such a thing as best practice, people don't follow it, as we know. So there's a limit to what's available openly. There's a patchiness to how different people are doing it. But also, it feels as though at some point in the case study you presented, it wasn't open, that it started with information from a state. We don't know who that was, so I presume it was closed information. So I'm interested in any thoughts you have about how open source is, or if there's a sort of a synergy between open and closed sources. And also, kind of in a secondary point, I'm sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you, so just respond in whatever way you want. The sense that good governance sort of relies on open source data collection. So Companies House in the UK is an example of that. And then if you have that sort of open information, then that can facilitate open source research, and that supports good governance. So this could be a really useful mechanism for supporting other issues. I know, as I said that, people could pick me up on whether Companies House does or does not do what it intends to do, but I'll hand over back to you now, Dan, to comment.
Thank you. Where do I begin? Okay, I think I'll first address the sort of closed sources question. Yes, this specific case does start with a UN member state sort of giving the panel a piece of information that says, "Hey, you might want to look into this." So this is what it is, and for a lot of sort of for a lot of cases of sort of proliferation concern, the inciting incident does start with something like this. Another thing that sort of that doesn't need to have that sort of like closed loop queuing is that sort of public open source investigators like us have the ability to sort of like sift through vast amounts of data in shipments that allow that of key HS codes or key sort of that have red flag behaviors of concern for us to start queuing up an investigation from there. Obviously, a lot of those things will start from a massive list, like we've done. I've shown you here. Even that. So imagine if. And that was even with a closed, very, very targeted queue. So imagine having to do that with a massive data set to start sifting through. So that's, but it is possible, and more sort of automated workflows can help with that. The second point about sort of the limits of open source and sort of the ethics behind it, I definitely agree. There are sort of different communities of practice sort of coalescing around this growing sort of field, and we don't necessarily know who everyone is. It's kind of like a bit of a dark forest theory of like different actors kind of in the dark forest, not knowing what everyone does, and because of that, there's no real kind of gravitation towards any norms. But I think that is slowly to happen. I think different different sort of like-minded practitioners are coming together and start talking about what they do, how they do it, like what we're doing here, and starting to talk about the questions of, okay, right, how is your GDPR compliance going? What ethical mandates do you go through? Do you have a right of reply process? Things like that are all parts of sort of questions and conversations we need to have as a community.
Oops. Thank you. You know, really, really great answers and very exciting. That thought that standards are emerging from this field, yes. And on that note, Dan, thank you very much for your comments. I'm going to hand over to Dan Plesch, because I think you might be following quite closely on thinking about communities in tracking systems. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Henrietta, and again, two fascinating contributions to add to the ones you've had in the previous webinars. I would like to really provide a bit of a personal and institutional backstory as to why the project and where we think it might go and what we think the need is. In the late 1980s, I had a commission from the MacArthur Foundation to cover and report on the conventional forces in Europe and open skies negotiations in Vienna in the late 1980s. And at that time, which was still very much the Soviet Union as a going concern, there was a certain amount of NGO and academic discussion and development of possible future arms control mechanisms. But certainly, I think if anyone had said that we would have achieved CFE and open skies, and indeed the Vienna Accords on confidence security building measures, and indeed the creation of the OSCE within a very few years, I think no one would have really thought that was credible. And yet there was interaction between political realities, some visionary political leadership, and the development of an expert community that helped enable that. Now, as we know, sadly, tragically, these architectures have been successively dynamited into rubble in recent years, and I don't think I have to remind this audience about that. And there's very little left. At the same time, we see a renewed weapons competition in the nuclear, the hypersonic, the conventional, etc., at the level of the P5 and their allies, and an intensity of what we used to call low intensity conflict, a high intensity if you happen to live there, of course. And that presents an objective problem of, do we think this is going to continue indefinitely without it all ending in a really major conflagration between some members of the P5? Well, I think generally speaking, that isn't a safe assumption. If we all, we would like to have assumed perhaps that at some point there'll be responsible people who would come to the fore. And indeed, some of my friends have a project on the responsible behavior of nuclear weapon states, which, given the leadership of some states at the minute, looks to be a slightly ironic undertaking, to put it mildly. So it's in that environment that the scrap project, particularly with the involvement of students, has gathered momentum in recent years. And a key part of that is, well, what would be the 21st century equivalent of the sorts of confidence security building measures, verification mechanisms that were really pioneered in the 1980s. And it was interesting, Henrietta and I had a succession of interviews with members of the Iraq inspection regimes, UNSCOM, UNMOVIC, in recent years, which were very illustrative. But I think one of the lessons that came from that to us was that many of the problems that they encountered would in the age of Google Earth, and with the sorts of approaches being demonstrated by participants in this webinar series, really much reduced. That the ability to conceal was, and indeed the concealment wasn't successful. The inspectors actually did a good job back in Iraq. The silver lining of that unhappy episode, that the potential there is to, I wouldn't say easy, but there is a great deal of potential. Now, there's a huge cognitive dissonance, because while, let us say, the world-educated community accepts as a viable proposition the development of science to apply to tackling the climate crisis, there is no understanding within that broad spectrum of civilization that controls on weapons are feasible or in any sense technically viable, which I think is a real cognitive dissonance given the expertise that we've heard in recent weeks, and indeed the practice of some 30 years ago. So rather than facing bemoaning the dynamiting of open skies and so forth, what we're about is saying, well, whether it's at the level of ongoing tragedies in Syria or other parts of the world, or the continuing competition by video. I just saw a video the Russians had released of a supposed hypersonic missile test. This kind of virility symbol competition between the powers gaining ground again. It's, I think, very badly needed to start introducing into the discussion the idea that controls, transparency is viable. Who might the recipients of this be? Now, of course, the late dear Professor Joseph Rotblat, Sir Joseph Rotblat, I think he didn't coin, but sought to disseminate the idea of citizens verification. And what we see in the different components that have been brought into this seminar series is that this open source non-governmental verification actually is developing and existing. And hopefully we can, in the months and year ahead, start to help develop this as a network. Now, Hans Blix, who we talked to, spoke of the idea of creating a service, which I think is an interesting idea, in a sense to develop a service, for example, for the use of parliamentary libraries, looking to track not just low intensity conflict, but the behavior of the P5 and their allies. One can see this mirroring to some degree the resources that major national intelligence operations are providing to their governments behind the scenes, but also feeding into possibly future treaty regimes. Some are the actors we spoke to, Rolf Chaos, I think favours the idea of a service for the Security Council. Well, given many people's jaundiced view of the behaviour of the Security Council, that isn't perhaps a top priority. But one can see there's a spectrum of potential user groups. There is a very broad constituency that, let us say, has a general understanding that environmental monitoring is essential and practical as a means of dealing with the climate crisis. And it's into this cognitive dissonance and this policy vacuum that I think that we can start to introduce these ideas. Because without them, I think we face, as it were, a recurrence of, in some ways, a worse recurrence of what we saw in the High Cold War, but without the expert community looking at strategic solutions and geostrategic solutions. And that, I think, is what we hopefully we can start to facilitate in the work that we're engaged in. And I would just feel encouraged, because certainly when I and some other colleagues were first engaged in these issues in the late 1980s, we couldn't possibly imagine what was achieved. The fact that we have managed to establish an effective, if incomplete, ban on explosive nuclear testing, and that despite all of their problems, there is significant positive impact from the various smaller weapons conventions, the Programme of Action on Small Arms, the cluster munitions and landmines bans, all without exaggerating it, have had significant positive impact. And these, I think, give us some hope and some tools that we can build on. And this exercise, hopefully, is a step towards creating such systems. And with a bit of luck, we might just be in time. Thanks, Henrietta.
Thank you, Dan. So I'm mindful of the time. It's 3 minutes to 3, and I intended that from 3 we'd segue to a more informal set of conversations. So anybody that wants to start thinking about making an in-person comment or question, please do be thinking about raising your hand or alerting me in some way. Dan, this was great. So you reminded us of the possibilities of global governance, that things have been achieved globally that people didn't think were possible, and they helped to build relationships, stabilize geopolitical tensions at difficult times. But you also reminded us of some of the problems in that area, that, not least that many of these treaties are deteriorating or being seen to deteriorate on different levels. And so you introduced this idea that we've heard before in the webinars about whether there's a chance that the technological opportunities afforded by this new approach to open source research, as well as the old styles of open source research, whether those sorts of transparency measures can help to support the development of global governance structures. And I was just wondering if you have any ideas about whether and how the open source research done by non-governmental organisations can be harnessed within international organisations or groups of states negotiating on different issues. Really, I ask that because I'm very mindful that the open source projects that we've heard to date are doing great stuff, and they're getting heard by the people that they want to get heard. So it's how to take it, if you've got any thoughts about how to take it to another level and a different set of audiences.
Well, that is a challenging question. I think if we're able to develop a network, I think we can look at ways of seeking dialogue with different international bodies, whether it's the Interparliamentary Union, OSCE or NATO parliamentary assemblies, or finding our way into the margins of ASEAN, NATO, other similar bodies, and indeed the influential think tank community. But I think at some point we have to find a way to have a dialogue perhaps with through media, with people concerned about and aware on the environmental side, in a sense to say, well, actually, this is a much more practical proposition, even than controlling the climate, because the technologies involved, well, to say, if it comes to counting battleships, to put it crudely, or tanks, it's a relatively simpler operation than greenhouse gas emissions and controls. But it is something which I don't know how to do. If I did it, we'd already have done it. And I think the ideas, but if we are able to develop a network community with an interest in this, that itself, I think, can show a broader community what is possible and what has been achieved.
Great, thank you. And that gives an interesting sort of, it might also be that the tracking weapons or tracking security related issues could actually help with the climate change things. It's not maybe either or. I've had a raised hand from Richard Jolly. Would you like to speak now, Richard, please? Thank you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to make one point about the power of research and people outside the UN. When we did the UN history, we identified that there was not one UN, there were three. The UN of governments, the UN of the staff members, and the third UN of outsiders pushing the UN, doing research, all of that. And when we looked at the UN's work over 70 years, we found that much was stimulated by the third UN. So keep it up. I've enjoyed this session.
Thank you. That's a really
thanks for the encouragement.
Exactly. Yes. Dan or Ali, would you like to come in on any of these thoughts about whether and how the technologies or the transparency can be used to promote global governance? Hi.
I find it difficult for me to think from an ACAPS perspective, because previously I worked for 6 years on small arms and light weapons. So, so everything that is, and specifically on the international instruments to control instruments. So I find it really hard to take an ACAPS perspective.
That's okay. We don't mind if it's not ACAPS.
But I think there are certain certain parallels in the sense that what ACAPS does is basically trying to fill a certain kind of information gap or data gap. I guess the big difference is that because it's in the humanitarian field, it's less sensitive and less contested. It's probably also less delicate to find a way in and being heard, and that organizations see the value of it because they actually want that information. So if I compare that to my experience with small arms and light weapons, what was said about the three UNs, I think that also fits well with my experience there. Often the problem is the government UN basically to get the foot into the door, but even there with persistence, I think over time often they see the value of this research, independent research, and how it can be based on findings of such research to move the organization forward. It's just very slow. Over.
Yeah, I guess from Alpha's KCL's perspective, I think sort of open source communities of practice definitely have a space to sort of inform, to be part of this sort of the surge of societal verification. It was what originally sort of the impetus behind how a Project Alpha grew as sort of to sort of bring a level of analytical and technical expertise into the open source field that was burgeoning, to sort of feed that back into either the international bodies or competent authorities where there's sort of proliferation of incidents of concern. So growing that community is probably the best thing we can do right now. And part of doing that is sort of recognizing sort of what we're all about, understanding, rallying around a key sort of ideas of community standards, rallying around key ideas of communities of practice and professionalization and ethical standards. I think that will be the most sort of the biggest enabler for sort of accelerating this endeavor.
Great, thank you. It feels as though things are kind of starting to come together. That we've heard people talk before about thinking about community best practice, thinking about ethical questions, and I'm aware that maybe more has been done on the ethics and the codes of practice in the humanitarian sector, but I really don't know very much about that. Dan, you're nodding. Ali, do you know anything about that field of open source research? I think Berkeley published some standards that I will be looking at. Yeah, Dan, you're nodding very much, so please can you come in and say more about that? Yeah.
So the Harvard University, I think around 2013, started the Signal Code, which is trying to draw upon current sort of human rights and legal instruments that are in current international law, and sort of like pick that towards what does that mean for humanitarian sort of data work? What rights does the individual have when you're doing like a rapid needs assessment? How, like, sort of what are the rights? How should you handle that data? So that's kind of like the humanitarian side, and sort of around about 2017, 18, 19, and until now, sort of University of Berkeley have sort of tried to sort of coalesce and draw some of sort of that idea into what they're doing in the Berkeley Protocol, which is kind of a sort of a best practice of how would a member of the public conduct a open source investigation ethically, sort of looking into sort of planning your investigations, looking into targets, what their rights are, what your responsibilities are, both for the individuals involved in what you're collecting about, but also sort of like what your ultimate mandate is towards. So those are all things that you have to sort of as I think like in the sort of the wild west of the open source world back in 2015, 16ish, we never had to sort of think about, but now it's sort of something that absolutely I think in order to sort of establish yourself as a force for as a credible force for societal verification, I think you definitely have to have these in order.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, and I'll follow up by looking lots of that up after the session. I'm interested though to kind of take it a step further, and maybe also Richard Dolly, you might like to come back on this. So in your presentation, Dan, you pointed out that China has to be part of this, and I'd extend that. The rest of the world needs to be part of this, and in the majority of my conversations and the majority of the speakers we've had at these webinars have been absolutely brilliant. There's no disrespect to them. They've tended to be from Western countries, and so is there a problem with Berkeley taking the initiative and calling it the Berkeley Protocol if we are wanting to roll it out to other people? And also, I think, Richard, you gave a really helpful idea about the third UN, and I wonder if we're going to really harness societal verification, if an extra layer of protections are needed for people. So in the Pugwash work, from the British Pugwash group, sorry, in the 1990s, there was some talk about developing systems to protect whistleblowers internationally. And I don't know if anybody feels that that's important, if as this community grows bigger and bigger. Radio silence on that one. Dan, do you have anything to say about those sorts of ideas?
I think they're very ambitious, like much else that we know, but that we've been discussing. I think there is, of course, we can see in the financial world and the corporate world a huge problem of whistleblowers in general. And you've only got to look at the crackdown in China, in Hong Kong, or the fate of American whistleblowers in the war on terror and information gathering. So, you know, finding the political will is very difficult. There is, though, I think the fact that a large amount of data really is publicly accessible. And if I had to kind of put it into a cartoon version, it would be to pick up the military balance from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, drop it into a machine reader where each of the weapons types could be paired up with its imagery, and then apply that to satellite imagery. As I say, this is a cartoon caricature of a process, but there's a very large amount of data that's available, and the potential to upscale the different nodes, I wouldn't say fragments, the different very imaginative and energetic and useful nodes that we've been working with over the last few weeks, shows the potential for a global system which doesn't have to rely upon whistleblowers in particularly. And while we are concerned with, to use I'm afraid a slightly hackneyed expression of mine, with the, as it were, the teenage drinkers of proliferation in Korea or Iran, that the real problem does remain the 5 confirmed alcoholics, sitting in the bar bemoaning the teenagers, and we have to keep a focus on them and their habits, and that is, I think, relatively more practical if you're looking at tracking major weapons platforms, particularly in times of crisis. And I think part of the precedent goes back to the original arms control confidence security building measures between NATO and the Warsaw Pact in the mid-1980s, when there really was an understanding that things might get completely out of hand, and introducing systems for military exercise notification, which still actually very quietly do remain intact within the OSCE region, and have had quite useful application in crises in Ukraine and elsewhere, and understandably don't want to attract media attention. But I think that these processes are things that I think can be enhanced. And once, in a sense, where it's a hackneyed phrase, again, excuse me, I keep trotting them out, but the phrase "the whole world is watching," I think does constrain the ability of decision makers and policy to act as if the whole world isn't watching. If we're looking at whether it's the South China Sea or activities on the Russia-Ukraine border, where both sides are flying bombers up and down on a regular basis now. So I think that there is an awful lot of potential without getting into the whistleblower world. And excuse me if I've given a typically long and rambling answer.
No, it's a very interesting answer. And for what it's worth, I think we've been feeling our way towards this through different conversations as well. The sense that if you start institutionalizing and forcing collaborations to happen, maybe you lose some of the rich creativity and flexibility that open source verification can give you. So Dan and Ali and Dan, you've all kind of given a sense of maybe organically growing community is really the best way forward. I'm just going to say we've had another question sent to me, reminding us that the motive of the UN was to promote unity and strength of the international community, and to promote peace and equality, and asking about the role of the UN Security Council. Now I'm going to kick this one off actually, because it refers back to the conversations Dan mentioned earlier. A couple of years ago, we interviewed some senior figures in the verified disarmament of Iraq, so UNSCOM and UNMOVIC, and one of the ideas that came from that hasn't really been taken up was to make the UN Security Council, give them access to verification expertise. It wouldn't need to be, because this would need to be fleshed out. And I wonder if the panelists have anything to say about the role of the UN, and if you think mechanisms for getting open source verification directly to the Security Council might help, or the sort of more happenstance world that we're living in. As Ali said, it takes time to build these sorts of connections, which is undoubtedly true. And I also think it takes time to build good treaty regimes. They don't just appear overnight. So I don't know if anybody wants to reflect on whether the Security Council should be factored into these sorts of considerations.
I think it could, and I'll bow to my colleagues in a second. I think it could, but I think actually a service that the non-permanent members and the Secretary General and the GA could draw upon would be something which is, relatively speaking, quite practical to create and to build. And indeed, it might be something that the network, if we're going to establish it, might be engaged in the same way it would be available to parliaments. And then out of that, one might see the practical application and possibly the P5 getting interested as well, ultimately. But the Secretary General can't go out and do it himself. The non-permanent members don't really have the resources, unless they're a state like Germany, which is so tied in to the P5, it wouldn't want, as it were, to put its intel on the table. But developing, a non-governmental or semi-governmental resource that is publicly available, then in a sense there isn't a problem for the Secretary General using that.
Great, thank you. I think Ali, you were going to come in. No, oh sorry, Dan, you were going to come in. Sorry, yeah.
I think the UN panel of experts system for a long time has kind of ostensibly tried to be the sort of this sort of stopgap measure of whenever there's a particular either disarmament or sanctions regime, or you have sort of the UN Security Council sort of constitutes a panel of experts to sort of give yearly updates on comprehensively on a problem set. So, for example, in South Sudan, in Mali, and also in the DPRK. So that system where the panel is constituted by sort of the composition of the panel is often sort of the rate limiting step in how this operationalizes, in my opinion. The selection process for these panel esteemed experts who are supposed to be A-class investigators or incredibly knowledgeable, either civil servants or from people from the NGO or investigative world about a particular problem set. Those always percolate up, but it's also a process of this panel trying to navigate the internal sort of dynamics of what Professor Jolly said about sort of the first and second UNs. So there's like a tiny bit of the third UN kind of trying to navigate between the first and second.
Yeah, so we live in a messy world, don't we? Thank you. I think that's a very interesting extra point about the panel of experts, that there already exist mechanisms for harvesting bits of information.
But they're just as constrained as any other members of the public.
Right. So I'm now going to ask each of you. We've got 10 minutes if we want to go to time, but I'm interested to think about your views on whether it's desirable or practical to think about scaling up the open source work that you do. So we've talked about, yes, it would be nice to have some sort of network to maybe share stuff, but can you see possibilities of extending what you do, more of the same, and if so, what would help with that? So clearly money would always help. But why I'm asking that is a sense that are the interconnections, are the overlaps between different groups actually potential synergies, and could time be saved if some sort of cooperation could be built into things? Obviously this is a massive question and you might think that you don't really, you can't answer on the spot, but there's also a sense, I think, you know, I don't know, I don't do open source research, but I think collaborations can be really tricky. I think there are often turf wars between different groups, if we're honest, and there might not be a magic wand to streamline different works. So I'm interested to get your thoughts on how you would like to see your own work scaled up, if that's possible, or if what we've got at the moment is just really great as it is, and the sense that an organic emerging community might be the best we've got. Yeah. Shall I ask Ali, do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I when your first email reached us with your request if you're interested in participating in a webinar, so I must admit, firstly, there was some head scratching going on because we didn't really see how we fit in, and then we had our discussion, and I think what I realized then, and this is also why I emphasized that in my presentation, was that what we can contribute to the discussion is a lot about how we try to solve things through procedures, processes, that this is more the innovative aspect. And I think in that sense, because I still feel like we are coming from a very different angle than probably most other organizations, that there is a very small risk of that we step on anyone else's toes or vice versa. But there is a big potential for us to learn, because as I said, we are also currently experimenting with data collection for building data sets. In terms of content, they might probably not be that helpful for what you are doing, but I think there could be a very valuable exchange just in terms of methods, because we all have tried things and know what worked and what didn't work. And I think that would be from our side certainly very interesting, and I think could lead to a very useful exchange. But then again, as I said, we are very unlikely to step on anyone's toes.
Oh, well done, Ali. And I'm always interested by this sense that maybe ACAPS is not central to weapons tracking, because I just think humanitarian issues are really front and center of tracking harmful technologies, and so the information I could fully imagine the information you collect could really enlighten wider tracking systems. Yeah, so that's going back to our discussion.
I completely agree. Just speaking from a personal perspective, I had a bit of non-NGO background, but a lot of my sort of current open source techniques and sort of like an experience comes from sort of doing crisis mapping from the sort of disaster response and sort of humanitarian disaster response space. There's a lot of sort of synergies currently being developed in terms of like using rapid response tools and sort of data sets and sort of a lot of different sort of synergies between sentiment analysis to sort of rapid needs assessment. A lot of synergies between sort of analyzing sort of trade flows into looking into conflict economies, and so I think those are incredibly sort of important synergies that we have that need to sort of be connected. And I, for one, I'm completely welcome sort of an avenue where communities of practice who don't normally sort of come together in a common watering hole should come and meet and sort of like check each other out, see how each other is doing things, and learn from each other.
Great, thank you, Dan. You know, it's very, very encouraging, this session. I'm finding this sense that there's room for everyone. There's room and there's opportunities to learn from everyone. Ali, that was a really practical sense that you gave of procedures, processes, methods. You can learn from each other and maybe get better, maybe save each other some time. Also, I was really struck by your presentation where you said that your work is done by trainees, short-term trainees, and then presumably they go out into the world and they have a richer understanding of data collection and what to do with it. Dan Liu, I would imagine that Project Alpha also trains lots of people. I have to say, in my research conversations, often people lead back to a connection with Project Alpha. There's quite a few hubs, I think, in this ecosystem. Yeah. So is that something as well that you think that is important, kind of training another generation in a very open-ended way?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. So we've got 4 minutes to go, and Dan, I'm going to invite you to reflect on the sort of networking ideas that Ali and Dan came up with. Sorry, there's Dan's. Does everybody know who I'm talking to? Dan Plesch, please
yes.
comment. Yeah.
I just feel very encouraged at a time when there's very little in the external environment to feel encouraging about. The fact that we are having analogous conversations with people such as yourself and veterans like Richard Jolly and Tariq Ralph, you know, in a sense, aren't saying, no, young people, don't be so silly. Or we tried this 50 years ago and it didn't work, or any of these other things. We're not getting that sort of reaction at all. And I think this has a lot of potential, and I feel very heartened that what really was I wouldn't say a passing thought, but Olamide and Martin Butcher, Henrietta and some of the students just talking these things over. And we've been working quite a lot with the Vatican, who got interested in the idea of a freeze. And well, you know, from freeze into tracking and verification, looking as a way to get backup for that idea. And so then, you know, Henrietta, with her usual aplomb, started pulling you all together. And I think it's more than we could have hoped at this stage, which is quite exciting, really.
Great. Thank you, Dan. I was listening as I was quickly typing. I agree. You know, this has been an absolutely fascinating session. We've gone into all sorts of different areas in more detail than we've had a chance to in previous sessions, and kind of brought together a sense of the practicalities, the technological possibilities, and some of the political needs, and maybe what next for the sector. I've posted in the chat details of our next webinar, which was in a couple of weeks. We've got another great set of practitioners, this time from Imperial College London, and RUSI and the New York Times Visual Investigations Unit. So please do join us for that if you can, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah, bye.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ali and Henrietta. Tremendous. Thanks.